struggled to meet their basic needs. That caused more class warfare. Along with extreme income inequality, there was corruption and extravagance at the top. The court of King Louis XVI was infamous for its frivolous spending. For instance, Marie Antoinette's Hamlet, an ornamental farm near the gardens of Versailles built at great expense to replicate a rustic village. Two major wars, the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, led to massive deficits. During the American Revolution, the deficits were around 2–3% of GDP and about a third of France's annual tax revenue. Meanwhile, the American Revolution further popularized Enlightenment ideas of liberty and equality, while bad harvests in 1788 and 1789 led to soaring bread prices and famines. It was a recipe for revolution. Due to France's inefficient and unrepresentative political decision-making system, the government was unable to raise needed revenues or enact needed changes. Decisions from the Ancien regime could be and often were undermined at virtually every lower level. The nobility and clergy resisted decisions that hurt them and were able to carve out broad privileges for themselves. Local authorities were needed to enact tax policy, but often resisted doing so. The closest thing France had to a legislative body was the Estates General, where representatives of France's 3 estates met to approve certain legislation when summoned by the king. Its consent was seen as necessary to levy new national taxes. However, its powers and procedures were unclear, and basic questions, like how representatives were chosen and how many votes each estate got, were unsettled. In 1789, the Third Estate, representing the commoners, who made up 98% of the population, formed its own assembly, inviting members of the First and Second Estates to join it. To stop this National Assembly from meeting, the king closed their meeting hall. Protests, riots, and insurrection arose. In 1791, a newly elected National Convention declared France a republic, and in January 1793 Louis XVI was sentenced to death. As is classic in revolutions, violence began soon after, in which those who were deemed insouciantly zealous were purged. It is estimated that between 20,000 and 30,000 people were executed during the French Reign of Terror. By 1795, France was broke, and the assignat, the currency it printed to finance government spending, was experiencing hyperinflation. As is also classic, the revolution led to a counterreaction in which the revolution's leaders were themselves arrested and a new constitution written and approved. The new system proved to be ineffective and was immediately crippled by financial problems. Still, the government continued to print money and forced wealthy citizens to loan it funds. Ultimately, the inflationary spiral was halted by the introduction of the hard currency that was acquired through Napoleon's successful military conquests in Italy and the decision to declare bankruptcy on 2/3 of the government's debt. Additional measures such as increased taxes further strengthened the government's fiscal condition. In 1796, the government held a ceremony in which it destroyed the presses it had been using to print money. Enter Napoleon. The bubble, the big wealth gaps, and the costly expense of war led to the bust and then to revolution, which threw out the old order and put in a new one. That new order consisted of revolutionary leaders who fought with each other, producing 10 years of painful chaos that required a strong leader to get control of the mess. It was all consistent with the classic, melodramatic script that has played innumerable times in the past. As if on cue, Napoleon entered the picture. Napoleon was the classic hero rising to the occasion. He had gained a sterling reputation as a military commander as France attempted to spread its republican system across Europe, and he was very popular. So, in 1799, he led a coup to install himself as RST consul and eventually emperor, and held dictatorial powers until 1814. Armed with centralized power and widespread support, he stabilized the economy and professionalized the government. France was widely seen as an empire on the rise and a formidable rival to other European powers. When Austria and Russia declared war on France, Napoleon scored sizable early military victories. Before long, he controlled Spain, Portugal, Italy, and much of Germany. I won't go through the history of the Napoleonic Wars, except to say that like other such leaders he overreached. Napoleon's invasion of Russia swung the tide of war against him. In the end, France was defeated. Great Britain and Russia were the primary victors. It should be noted that a significant factor in the war was the UK's much greater financial strength. Because of their financial strength, the UK was able to lend a lot of money to the European coalition forces against France. It was both its financial resources and its naval power that allowed Britain to stay in the GHT even as it and its allies sustained repeated defeats. A new world order, the Congress of Vienna. By now you know how these things go. After a war, the victors come together and create a new world order. That happened at the Congress of Vienna. Just as the victors of the 30 Years' War had done at Westphalia, the Quadruple Alliance of Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia reorganized the world order in their favor at the Congress of Vienna, creating a system of checks and balances among the European powers that would more or less hold for the next century. The geopolitical importance of these developments is well described by Henry Kissinger. It may not have fully led all the hopes of an idealistic generation, but it gave this generation something perhaps more precious. A period of stability which permitted their hopes to be realized without a major war or a permanent revolution. The period of stability which ensued was the best proof that a legitimate order had been constructed, an order accepted by all the major powers, so that henceforth they sought adjustment within its framework rather than in its overthrow. All the major powers were represented in Vienna, though the most important decisions were negotiated by the core group and France itself. Like the US at the Paris Peace Conference after World War I, and in the negotiations after World War II, the UK didn't seek to gain significant new territories. Its primary goal was to address the power imbalances in Europe that had led to wars. Areas that had previously consisted of weak and divided states, such as Italy, Germany, and the Low Countries, saw significant territorial consolidation to counterbalance more centralized states like France, while agreements on the navigation of international rivers supported the expansion of trade. Tactically, the treaties of Paris aimed to contain but not destroy France, which sustained only a minimal loss of territory. The victorious powers were all monarchies, and many of the policies they enacted were aimed at restoring the old status quo. Even so, the new ideas of the Enlightenment continued to have influence. Governments shifted to more representative and rule-of-law-based systems, though to varying degrees. In England, the liberalization came about as a result of gradual reforms, while on the continent a series of revolutions spurred the changes. In time, nationalist movements led to the unification of Germany and Italy, as well as the destabilization of the multi-ethnic Austrian and Ottoman empires. British power approaches its peak. No power benefited more from the new stability than the British Empire. Not only were Britain's main economic and military rivals weakened, but the power equilibrium allowed the UK to avoid expensive military conflicts close to home and focus on trade and its colonies, a policy known as splendid isolation, which set the stage for its imperial century. Of course, there were some bad economic periods during those years, and there were military conflicts. But these were not significant enough to change the big picture, which was of a very prosperous period with the British on top. As mentioned, at their peak in the late 19th century around 1870, the British produced 20% of the world's income and controlled 40% of global exports, 20% of the world's land mass, and 25% of the world's population. And the pound, of course, became the world's undisputed reserve currency. The charts on the following pages help paint the picture of Britain's dominant strength. Geopolitically, the UK continued to expand abroad throughout the 19th century, eventually encompassing Canada, Australia, India, and large portions of Africa. And even where the British Empire didn't explicitly take control, it was increasingly able to intervene abroad in order to gain trade access on uneven terms. Maintaining these colonies gave the UK an assured source of commodities, wealth, and income, and preferential trade arrangements. This chart clearly paints the picture. The top. The pound's status as a reserve currency complemented its dominance in colonial expansion, military reach, global trade, and investment hours. The UK's share of global exports rose with the Industrial Revolution and the spread of the empire, peaking around 1850 at about 40% of global exports. And the share of trade denominated in sterling was greater than the UK's trade share alone. From 1850 to 1914, Around 60% of global trade was denominated in pounds. This set of conditions sowed the seeds of the decline that typified the top phase of the big cycle. Even as the UK's share of world exports declined, the UK ran a persistent current account surplus throughout this period. After 1870, this was comprised of a persistent trade deficit funded by returns on overseas investments. The income from the current account surpluses funded an increasing share of global cross-border investment as other countries become more attractive to invest in. In 1818, the English Rothschild Bank made its RST major government loan to Prussia. As the pound became increasingly liquid, a wave of other sovereign borrowers followed, and global debt, global trade, and global capital outlets all came to be increasingly denominated in sterling. Trust in the pound was bolstered by the economic management of the Bank of England, which increasingly operated as a lender of last resort to mitigate the effects of banking panics. Even as the British Empire continued to expand its territorial and financial reach over the decades of the 19th century, the seeds of its fall were evident, driven by the classic factors of 1. Declining competitiveness, 2. Rising inequality and con-ICT, and 3. The rise of new rivals, particularly Germany and the US. Declining competitiveness. Stepping back, the broader story of economic growth in the mid to late 1800s was the Second Industrial Revolution, a sustained period of innovation in which science as well as engineering played a major role. As synthetics and new alloys were produced and the use of new energy sources like petroleum and electricity exploded. This was when the telephone and the incandescent light bulb were developed and automobiles soon followed. Transportation, communications, and infrastructure improved, and the rise of corporate capitalism enhanced productivity. The result was a sizable increase in output per worker in the countries able to make the switch east silently, primarily the US and Germany. The UK didn't keep up, even though British inventions were key to many of these new developments. The UK's failure to reorganize its industries led to marked declines in output per worker relative to the other leading industrial powers. You can see the secular shift in innovation and economic power in these charts. Rising inequality. The gains from industrialization were distributed very unevenly in the UK, producing extreme levels of inequality. By the late 1800s, the top 1% of the population owned over 70% of all wealth, more than in peer countries. The UK's top 10% owned an astounding 93% of its wealth. As shown in the next chart, the peak in the wealth gap coincided with the peak in the British Empire around 1900, which was the beginning of the next wave of con-ICT over wealth and power due to large wealth gaps and the classic late big cycle conditions described in Part 1. The combination of social change and rising inequality sparked significant tensions. England's policy response in the mid-1800s focused largely on reform bills that expanded voting rights and reduced the corrupt practices that had made elections less democratic. By the early 1900s, those political reforms were followed by social reforms, which included the introduction of a public pension system, medical and unemployment insurance, and the provision of free lunches for school children. Organized labor was also on the rise, strengthening workers' bargaining power. By 1911, around 25% of eligible men were union members, and the Labour Party became a significant force in politics. This greater power took the form of increasingly large strikes, for example, the RST national strike by coal miners in 1912, which led to a minimum wage for miners. Geopolitical rivals emerge. In addition to its domestic issues, the UK faced challengers to its empire abroad, competing for influence with France in Africa, Russia in the Middle East and Central Asia, and the US in the Americas. Its most significant rivalry, however, was with Germany. The United States, the other great rising power, remained blissfully isolationist with a big ocean allowing it to largely ignore the conics in Europe. When the New World Order began at the Congress of Vienna, Germany was still divided into a number of smaller states. While the Austrian Empire, ruled by the Habsburgs, had a lot of influence, Prussia was swiftly rising and had one of the strongest armies in Europe. Over the next century, it successfully uni-ed the other German states, becoming a RST-rate power. It achieved this thanks in large part to Otto von Bismarck's brilliant strategic and diplomatic leadership and the other classic ingredients for success: strong education and competitiveness. Once uni-ed, Germany experienced the classic virtuous cycle of a power on the rise. Viewing an active education system as a crucial step in its quest to raise its economy to the level of Great Britain's, the New Germany, and its predecessor states, built one from the ground up, focusing on teaching both practical trade skills and high-level scientific knowledge, theoretical and applied. Starting in the 1860s, primary education was mandatory for all and enforced by law. Germany also established 3 new research universities. In order to create a culture of innovation, the German government provided credit to corporations, along with technical advice and assistance, awarded grants to inventors and immigrant entrepreneurs, bestowed gifts of machinery, and allowed rebates and exemptions of duties on imports of industrial equipment. Germany also maintained a strong rule of law, which was explicitly aimed at economic development. As a result of these efforts, Germany's share of the world's manufacturing output increased from about 5 to 13% between 1860 and 1900, while the other European powers' shares stagnated or decreased. By 1900, Germany's GDP had surpassed Britain's, although the latter was still the leading trading nation in the world. While Bismarck was a skilled diplomat who prioritized economic development and diplomacy with international competitors, his successors were less skilled and more aggressive. When Wilhelm II became emperor in 1888, he forced Bismarck to resign and adopted a policy of turning Germany into a world power. This led other powers, primarily Russia and the UK, to increasingly align with France in an effort to contain Germany. Wilhelm moved to build up Germany's military, particularly its navy, setting an arms race with the UK. This began the next rivalry between great powers. The UK retained its naval advantage, but the arms race strained the lances of the major powers and further destabilized the geopolitical order. The rivalry between the UK and Germany was just one of many building across Europe. France and Germany were at odds. Germany was increasingly concerned about Russian industrialization, and Austria and Russia were struggling for influence in the Balkans. Though these countries were intertwined through marriage and commerce more than ever before, and despite most people believing it wouldn't happen, in 1914 the powder keg exploded into all-out war. This was the RST World War because this was the RST time the world had become so small and so interconnected that most of the major parts of the world were involved in one way or another. Given the complexity and scale of World War I, and how extensively it has been written about, I will just attempt to convey the big picture. It was terrible. The war killed about 8.5 million soldiers and 13 million civilians, leaving all of Europe exhausted, weakened, and indebted. Russia devolved into revolution in 1917. In 1918, the Spanish arrived, killing an estimated 50 million people around the world over the next 2 years. As a percentage of the European population, more people died during this period than in either the Napoleonic Wars or 30 Years' War. But the war ended and the next new world order was created. In 1919, the victors, the US, Britain, France, Japan, and Italy, met at the Paris Peace Conference to lay out the new world order in the Treaty of Versailles. The United States, now recognized as a leading power, played a big role in the negotiations. In fact, the term, New World Order, was coined to describe U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's vision for a global governance system. If the Congress of Vienna in 1815 had created a relatively sustainable order, the terms of the Paris Peace Conference did the opposite. It made a second war inevitable, though it wasn't apparent at the time. The territories of the losing powers were carved up, and they were forced to pay reparations to the victors. Those debt burdens contributed to an inflationary depression in Germany from 1920 to 1923. Elsewhere, much of the world entered a decade of peace and prosperity, the Roaring Twenties. As is typical, the debts and the wealth gaps that were built up burst in 1929, causing the Great Depression. These two big boom and bust cycles came unusually close together, though they followed the classic stages. I won't digress into the 1920s boom to bust sequence here as it was covered elsewhere in this book. But I will pick up the story in the Great Depression. The Great Depression coupled with the large wealth gaps led to a rise in populism and extremism in nearly every major country. In some countries, e.g., the US and the UK, this led to big redistributions of wealth and political power while capitalism and democracy were maintained. In others, particularly those with weaker economies, populist dictators seized control and sought to expand their empires. Classically, before all-out wars begin, there is typically about a decade of economic, technological, geopolitical, and capital skirmishing. The time between the Depression and World War II was consistent with this rule. As Germany and Japan became more expansionist, they increasingly competed with the UK, the US, and France for resources and influence over territories. Ultimately, those tensions boiled over into war. World War II, just 2 decades after World War I, was even more costly in lives and money. Germany and Japan lost and the US, the UK, and the Soviet Union won, though economically the UK and the Soviet Union lost too and the US gained enormously in relative wealth. GDP per capita in Germany and Japan fell by at least half, and their currencies collapsed in the aftermath of the war, as these charts show. As is typical, the winners of the war got together and determined a new world order in 1945. The decline? The Allied victory in 1945 produced a tremendous shift of wealth and power, with the US emerging as the world's dominant empire just as the British had after the Napoleonic Wars. The British were left with large debts, a huge empire that was more expensive to maintain than it was profitable, numerous rivals that were more competitive, and a population that had big wealth gaps that led to big political gaps. It took another 20 years for the British pound to fully lose its status as an international reserve currency. Just as the English language is so deeply woven into the fabric of international business and diplomatic communications that it would be difficult to replace, the same is true of reserve currencies. Other countries' central banks continued to hold sizable shares of their reserves in pounds through the 1950s, and a third of all international trade was still denominated in sterling in 1960. But the pound had been losing status since the end of the war because smart investors recognized the great contrast between the UK's and the US's financial conditions, the UK's increased debt load, and the UK's low net reserves, which would make holding pound sterling debt a bad deal. The decline in the British pound was a protracted era that involved several significant devaluations. After attempts to make the pound convertible failed in 1946-47, it was devalued by 30% against the dollar in 1949. Though this worked in the short term, over the next 2 decades. Britain's declining competitiveness led to repeated balance of payments strains that culminated with the devaluation of 1967. Around this time the Deutsche Mark took the pound's place as the world's second most widely held reserve currency. The following charts paint the picture. The pound's suspended convertibility in 1947 and its devaluation in 1949. The 1940s are frequently referred to as crisis years. For the pound, the war required the UK to borrow immensely from its allies and colonies, and those obligations were required to be held in sterling. When the war ended, the UK could not meet its debt obligations without either raising taxes or cutting government spending, so it necessarily mandated that its debt assets could not be proactively sold by its former colonies. The US was anxious for the UK to restore convertibility as soon as possible, as the restrictions were reducing liquidity in the global economy, affecting the US's export pro-TS. The Bank of England was also eager to remove capital controls in order to restore the pound's role as a global trading currency, increase financial sector revenues in London, and encourage international investors to continue saving in sterling. In 1946, an agreement was reached in which the US would provide the UK with a loan of $3.75 billion to OABU or against a potential run on the pound as expected. The pound came under considerable selling pressure when partial convertibility was introduced in July 1947, and the UK and the sterling area countries turned to austerity to maintain the pound's peg to the dollar. Restrictions were imposed on the import of luxury goods, defense expenditures were slashed, dollar and gold reserves were drawn down, and agreements were made among sterling economies to not diversify their reserve holdings to the dollar. Prime Minister Clement Attlee gave a dramatic speech calling for the spirit of wartime sacrifice. "We are engaged in another battle for Britain. This battle cannot be won by the few. It demands a united effort by the whole nation. I am confident that this united effort will be forthcoming and that we shall again conquer. Immediately following the speech, the run on the pound accelerated. By the end of August, convertibility was suspended, much to the anger of the U.S. and other international investors who had bought sterling assets in the lead-up to convertibility. The governor of the National Bank of Belgium threatened to stop transacting in sterling, requiring a diplomatic intervention. The devaluation came 2 years later, as policy makers in both the UK and the US realized that the pound couldn't return to convertibility at the current rate. Competitiveness returned, the current account improved, and by the mid to late 1950s full convertibility was restored. The following charts paint the picture. The devaluation did not lead to a panic out of sterling, even though the fundamentals remained poor, because a very large share of UK assets was held by the US government, which was willing to take the valuation hit in order to restore convertibility, and by sterling area economies, such as India and Australia, whose currencies were pegged to the pound for political reasons. Still, the immediate post-war experience made it clear to knowledgeable observers that the pound would not enjoy the same international role it had prior to World War II. The failed international efforts to support the pound in the 1950s and 1960s, and the devaluation of 1967. Though the 1949 devaluation helped in the short term, the pound faced recurring balance of payments strains. These were very concerning to international policymakers, who feared that a collapse in the value of sterling or a rapid shift to the dollar could prove highly detrimental to the new Bretton Woods monetary system. As a result, numerous efforts were made to shore up the pound and preserve its role as a source of international liquidity. In addition, the UK mandated that all trade within the common market would be denominated in pounds and all its currencies pegged to sterling. The result was that for the 1950s and early 1960s, the UK was best understood as a regional economic power and sterling as a regional reserve currency. Yet those measures still didn't fix the problem. The UK was too indebted and too uncompetitive. It couldn't pay its debts and still buy what it needed to import. Sterling had to be devalued again in 1967. After that, even sterling area countries were unwilling to hold their reserves in pounds unless the UK guaranteed their underlying value in dollars. After the devaluation, little faith remained in the pound. Central banks began to sell their sterling reserves and buy dollars, Deutsche Marks, and yen, as opposed to simply accumulating fewer pounds in new reserve holdings. The average share of sterling and central bank reserve holdings collapsed within 2 years. Countries that continued to hold a high share of their reserves in pounds after 1968 were holding de facto dollars because the sterling agreement of 1968 guaranteed 90% of their dollar value. Europe after World War II. As we've seen again and again, the terrible costs of war pushed countries to create new world orders in their aftermaths in an attempt to ensure that such wars can never happen again. Naturally, new world orders revolve around the victor, which is often the newly ascendant empire. After World War II, that was clearly the US. The most important geopolitical elements of the post-war order were: the US was the dominant power, which made it the de facto global police force. Naturally, tensions almost immediately arose between the US and the world's second leading power, the Soviet Union. The US and its allies formed a military alliance called NATO, and the Soviet states formed the Warsaw Pact, and the two faced in the Cold War. The United Nations was established to resolve global disputes. As is classic, it was headquartered in the heart of the ascendant empire, with its main power organ, the Security Council, dominated by the war's victors, as is also classic. The most important financial elements of the New World Order consisted of the Bretton Woods monetary system, which established the dollar as the world's reserve currency. The IMF and the World Bank, designed to support the new global financial system. New York as the new global financial center. From the European perspective, the key aspect of the New World Order was the shift from a balance of power in which the preeminent European powers were on top to a world in which they were exhausted and overshadowed by new superpowers that dwarfed any one European state. Given these pressures and the clear lesson of the costs of division that the world wars had taught, the value of European unity was clear. That was the impetus for the new European order that gradually developed into the European Union. The story of Robert Schuman, a key founder of the EU, helps explain why Europe came together. Schumann's father was a French citizen who became a German citizen when his home region of Alsace-Lorraine was annexed by the Germans in 1871. Schumann was born a German citizen, but became a French citizen when Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France after World War I. As a politician in World War II, he joined the Vichy government before abandoning it for the French resistance. He ended the war in hiding, with a 100,000 Reichsmark bounty on his head. A key partner to Schumann was West Germany's RST post-war chancellor, Konrad Adenauer. A centrist mayor, he had been driven from political life by the Nazis and sent to a concentration camp in 1944. Following his election as chancellor as a Christian Democrat in 1949, his policies focused on rebuilding the German economy, reconciling with other European powers, and opposing communism. Schumann and Adenauer's project, along with the rest of the EU's founders, was to make war not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. Their RST step was to create the European Coal and Steel Community. It sounds like a narrow economic pact, but its explicit goal was to create a European federation. From the Schuman Declaration, the pooling of coal and steel production should immediately provide for the setting up of common foundations for economic development as a RST step in the Federation of Europe, and will change the destinies of those regions which have long been devoted to the manufacture of munitions of war, of which they have been the most constant victims. The agreement created supranational bodies, a high authority, a common assembly, and a court of justice that bound individual countries to its decisions and regulations, had the ability to levy taxes, could issue loans, and set up programs for worker welfare. 6 nations signed on, and more joined over time. Eventually it evolved into a customs union, opened up countries' borders, and eventually agreed on the framework for a political and economic union, including a shared European citizenship. As is classic, this new European geopolitical order came with a new natural economic order. The Maastricht Treaty created the basis for a new common currency and common economic rules, including rules around government assets. The integration of its 27 member states, many of whom had been at war with one another in the past, is an impressive feat, one that puts the EU on a similar standing to the other great powers. The Eurozone compared to the US and China. Empire scored GDP per capita. GDP population. Military spending, college grads, Nobel Prizes, equity, MKT cap, INTL, transactions in currency. Official reserves held in currency. Europe Empire arc treats major Eurozone countries as of comparison. The European Union's relative declines and crises in the early 21st century occurred for the classic reasons big cycle declines occurred, which are re-acted in the 8 measures of power and other indicators described in Chapter 2. These are the same reasons that other empires have experienced crises. More specifically, Europe's debt is large, its economy is fundamentally weak, its internal connects are relatively large, its vitality and level of inventiveness are relatively weak, and its military is not strong. The wealth and income inequalities between and within its member countries have fueled the rise of populists, many of whom opposed the European Union, and who succeeded in causing the UK to leave it. In short, from its position of a leading empire not long ago, Europe as a whole has slipped to a position of secondary power. Let's now turn our attentions to the American and Chinese powers. This law created monopolistic joint stock companies to trade in both the East and West Indies. Colbert's ordinance was motivated by the desire to fund the trading companies using private funds, and not through the government. The Treaty of Paris in 1814 saw France restore its borders to what they were in 1792, which meant France actually got back some of the colonial territories that the UK had taken during the wars. The Treaty of Paris in 1815, after Napoleon returned from exile and was defeated a second and NAL time, was less favorable, requiring France to pay a large indemnity, accept an army of occupation, and cede some additional territory, but still left France with the vast majority of the land it had controlled at the time of the French Revolution. A crucial dimension of the UK's early expansion was the role played by the British East India Company, which starting in the late 18th century and continuing into the 19th century consolidated its political and economic control of modern-day India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. This vast area remained under the private control of the company until a major rebellion in 1857 led the British state to step in and take over India as a British territory. While there were widespread private holdings of pounds internationally, it's worth noting that for most of the 1800s there wasn't much in the way of central bank holdings, particularly relative to the role that the dollar plays in central bank portfolios today. Through World War I, central bank assets outside their own currency were generally held in precious metals. The Panic of 1866 demonstrates this well. To simplify the events, the London money markets were the most liquid markets for trade nats, but after a decade of boom, lots of lenders were overextended and a big one went bust. It was the 19th century equivalent of Lehman Brothers. However, the crisis resolved within days as the Bank of England's demonstrated willingness to serve as the lender of last resort stemmed the loss of Khan Denke in the system. GBR GDP share includes income of countries controlled by the British Empire. For comparison, the top 1% share of wealth in the UK today is about 20% and the top 10% share is about 50%. While Prussia, and later the German Empire, were monarchies ruled by the Hohenzollern family, Bismarck had immensely active powers, having been appointed by the monarch RST as Minister-President of Prussia, and then as Chancellor of Germany from Uni-Katainen in 1871 until 1890. According to historian Eric Hobsbawm, remained undisputed world champion at the game of multilateral diplomatic chess for almost 20 years after 1871. This chart shows the OCIL exchange rate between dollars and Deutsche Marks as well as an UNO-CIL rate that was based on actual transactions between New York and Germany during that time period. The UNO-CIL rate shows that the true value of the Deutsche Mark was collapsing during the period. Chapter 11. The Big Cycle Rise and Decline of the United States and the Dollar. This chapter covers the big cycle rise of the US beginning in the 19th century, its gradual surpassing of the UK as the world's most powerful empire, and its recent decline. As the story of the US as the world's leading empire is still unfolding and is highly relevant to the world today, I will be going through its big cycle in more detail than I did for the Dutch and British, especially as it relates to the dollar's status as a global reserve currency, and the economic and monetary policy forces that have impacted it. The chart on the next page shows the 8 types of power that make up our overall U.S. arc. In them you can see the story behind the U.S.'s rise and decline since 1700. The strong development and excellence in education led to advances in innovation and technology, competitiveness in world markets, and economic output, all of which fueled the development of financial markets and the U.S. as a financial center, its leadership in military strength and world trade, and, with a significant lag, the emergence of the dollar as a reserve currency. The relative advantages in education, competitiveness, and trade have fallen, while those in innovation and technology, reserve currency status, and financial markets and financial center status remain strong. What this chart doesn't show are the deviations in the U.S. income and balance sheet conditions and its internal conics, both of which are more concerning. This next chart combines all the factors to show the overall arc of the U.S. from before the Revolutionary War, marking the key events along the way. The numbers mark the approximate times of the 6 stages of the internal order cycle. Now we will go through the U.S.'s story from the beginning until the time of my writing. The rise. As with all new countries and dynasties, the U.S. went through the usual revolution and post-revolution process in which it created a new domestic order as 1. A coordinated group of strong leaders fought to gain control. 2. That group won and consolidated control. 3. The new leadership had a vision supported by the population. But 4. It split into factions that had conics over how the government should work to implement that vision. Eventually, these factions 5 girt out the system for control and laid it out in agreements. 6. Set up the parts of government, e.g., the money and credit system, the legal system, the legislative systems, the military, etc. And 7. Put people in jobs and made it work well. The U.S. did these things in a uniquely peaceful way through negotiations, near total respect for agreements, and good designs for governance that gave it a great start. In the chart showing the 8 types of power, you can see that rapidly improving levels of education preceded the big rises in innovation, technology, and competitiveness, which lasted until the World Wars, with an interruption during the U.S. Civil War. There were many ups and downs in both domestic and external money debt, economic, and military circumstances. I won't take you through them in detail, though I will note that all of them followed the archetypical patterns driven by the same basic cause-effect relationships previously described here. While the ascent of the U.S. was most pronounced after World War II, it really started in the late 1800s. That's where we'll pick up the story. After the U.S. Civil War came the Second Industrial Revolution, which was one of those classic times in which the peaceful pursuit of wealth and prosperity created great gains in incomes, technologies, and wealth in England, continental Europe, and the United States. In the U.S., these gains were enhanced through a system of free market capitalism that, as is classic, produced both lots of wealth and big wealth gaps. These gaps led to discontent and progressive era policies that broke up rich and powerful monopolies and raised taxes on the rich, starting with the passage of a constitutional amendment to allow federal income taxes in 1913. The U.S.'s increased strengths were re-acted in its rising shares of global economic output and world trade, as well as its growing financial strength, continuing leadership in innovation, and great usage of its financial products. The long ascent of the dollar and U.S. capital markets. The dollar's path to being the world's dominant reserve currency was far from straightforward. In the U.S.'s RST century of existence, its financial system was completely underdeveloped. Banking worked in the United States in the classic ways it did in most countries, as I described in chapters 3 and 4. In other words, hard money was put into banks that together lent out much more than they had. That Ponzi scheme unraveled, so banks failed to meet their commitments and devalued the money. The U.S. had no central bank to control financial markets or act as a lender of last resort. The U.S. went through many boom-bust cycles, in which classically a area of debt-enhanced investments became overextended, leading to credit losses and a credit crunch. As a result, banking system panics were extremely common. In New York alone, 8 significant banking panics occurred between 1836 and 1913, and regional banking panics were also common. This was because the highly fragmented banking system had a rigid amount of currency, no deposit insurance, and a pyramidal reserve system that heightened the risk of contagion from one bank going under. Like London, New York was well established as a trading center long before it became a global financial center, a development that didn't occur until after the turn of the 20th century. Only 2 U.S. banks made the list of the top 20 largest global banks in 1913, at numbers 13 and 17. In comparison, British banks occupied 9 slots, including 3 of the top V. For perspective, at this point the U.S. was far larger than the UK in economic output, and they were neck and neck